Sessions have been, all have had a focused topic. Today's focused topic is climate change and resiliency. So the speakers that we have will be focused on that. We'd like the audience members who do want to make a comment to comment on that if they wish, but it's an open forum, so if there are other issues related to transportation and the future of transportation that you'd like to make, you're welcome to do so. The 5 listening sessions match the 5 different work groups of the Commission. This one is climate change and resiliency. The first one we held was held at UMass Amherst on technology, automated vehicles, electronic vehicles, and so forth. The most recent session was held at UMass Boston on land use, demographics, and the economy. A session was held at UMass Worcester, focused really on the electrification possibilities of the transportation system. And Abby, was the 5th one in Lowell? Carrie?
Yes.
Yeah. And this was focused on transit, active transportation, and mobility as a service. We've found the sessions incredibly useful. The way that we're approaching the work is in 3 parts. Governor Baker has been and continues to be and has charged us to be first and foremost focused on facts. So we've launched a very in-depth effort on key topics, facts, trends, and what the key issues are, again related to the 5 topic areas. The charge of the group is not about projects. It's not about something that would happen in the next year, 24 months, or 36 months. The charge of the group is really to look at the year 2040. So that's some 22 years out. And some of us can think back what it was like 20 years ago and how things have changed in a variety of topics. Never mind 40 years ago and the speed of technology today. Governor Baker has charged this group, and it's the first group in the nation actually at a statewide level to look at the technology changes, the potential changes in climate, the changes in demographics and land use, and the impacts on the electric grid and so forth. And so our charge is to look at and make recommendations to the governor and lieutenant governor for the year 2040. And we're just about to start our recommendation stage. And so the information that we've received at each one of these listening sessions has been terrific. And there is a website and a email address that if you have further information or comments that you'd like to make, you can do so. What I want to do now is I'm going to ask each one of the commission members to introduce themselves, and I'd like Secretary Beaton to speak maybe a little bit longer about what he's up to, and then each of our 3 speakers, they know they're not supposed to speak for more than 10 minutes. I may ask them a follow-up question. I may ask the commission members for it to be a follow-up question. And so we are in fact listening to the faculty. They get a little bit more time than the general public. But as these are listening sessions, we want to spend our time listening to you all. And so I will ask, and folks have been very good at each of the other sessions, is to keep your comments to about 3 minutes. If it starts to drag on, you'll get a ding. And in that way, we ensure that everybody has a chance to speak. In previous sessions, some folks, after we've gone all the way through, have had the opportunity to speak again on a different topic or a follow-up topic. So that's our run of show. I'm going to pass the mic. And we have one other thing before we go to the speakers. We will leave this table and show you this wonderful video, which doesn't last long. But here's Secretary Beaton.
Thank you very much, Steve. And thanks to all of you for being here with us today. As Steve outlined, a very important process for us, and the governor's commissioning of this organization. A lot of great minds at the table, really trying to push the envelope on trying to understand various scenarios for what the future of transportation is and the challenges facing the Commonwealth. Steve, as Steve indicated, today's focus is climate change, and as you can imagine, inside of the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, we are very much involved with and tasked with meeting our terms of the Global Warming Solutions Act and implementing Governor Baker's Executive Order 569 signed about 2 years ago regarding all things climate change, both on the mitigation side, reducing our carbon emissions, but also a renewed focus on adaptation and resiliency. And the transportation sector, as you can imagine, plays a vital role in both sides. We need to harden our transportation infrastructure, make sure we identify vulnerabilities in the transportation sector, and especially looking forward into the future. How do we make them more resilient and adapted to climate change? That is very much a focus of a lot of the work that we have going on inside of EEA in a statewide effort, working with our municipalities under our MVP program, and really trying to understand from every corner of the Commonwealth what are our key pieces of infrastructure and our vulnerable assets, working with a number of partners throughout, certainly the folks from UMass at the Climate Science Center, are really trying to now start to get our heads around the scale and the scope of what it is that we're up against as the climate continues to change. And additionally, on the mitigation side of the house, the whole world right now is wrestling with what to do with the emissions coming out of the transportation sector. It's been the most challenging. It has been the one that I think every province, state, and nation is really trying to understand as the technology changes and as the transportation options increase and evolve for the individual consumers. What does that look like? What are the effects on the electric grid, on load, times of peak load? All these different variables factor in as we move towards electrification. What does that look like for our carbon emissions profile? And how do we create policies that allow for this transition to happen smoothly and as quickly as possible? And these are all the things throughout these listening sessions and throughout the entire Transportation Commission that we're looking at through the lens of climate. A lot of focus both on that mitigation side and reducing our carbon emissions as the technology comes online and the transfer happens. And then also the adaptation and resiliency side is a key critical component. So this is certainly this body of work is a great complement to a lot of the work already underway at EEA and throughout all of state government through the things that I described. And it fits in perfectly with the decisions we need to make and the policies we need to implement going forward to make sure that we're both adapted and have a resilient transportation sector, but are also maximizing the opportunity to reduce carbon emissions coming out of the sector as well. So I very much look forward to engaging and hearing everybody's comments. And once again, thank you all very much for being with us today.
My name's Tim McGurthy. I'm a member of the commission, so my job here is really to listen and to learn. I'm the executive director of the Worcester Regional Research Bureau. Before that, I was the chief development officer for the city of Worcester and director of policy for the Boston Redevelopment Authority.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Karen Conard. I'm the executive director of the Merrimack Valley Planning Commission. And it feels like 100 years ago I worked for Mass Development when we built this building, so it's really nice to be back and to see it put to such good use. So maybe we'll put on the video now.
Transportation in the Commonwealth is not important for what it is, but rather for what it does, gets people where they need to go, and shapes the economy of communities. But transportation as we know it is changing through advancements in technology like ride-sharing programs and autonomous vehicles, shifts in the state's demographics with an aging population, and changes in the environment with more frequent major weather events. Governor Baker issued an executive order to create the Commission on the Future of Transportation in the Commonwealth to address these challenges and opportunities we'll face in the future. This commission will help Massachusetts better understand how these changes will affect transportation patterns and needs of our constituents. We've assembled a team of leaders from the public sector, academia, and the not-for-profit world to draft a report to advise the governor and lieutenant governor as we prepare for transportation in 2040.
The governor has asked this commission to do something that is very unusual for state government. It's to look 20 years in the future. It's not looking at today, it's not looking at a year from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now. 5 years from now for most of state government is a long time away. We're doing something that is very unusual, and to think about what the world might be 20 years from now.
It's a fascinating time in transportation. Technology is changing, the demographics of the people we serve are changing, our climate is even changing, and the Commission can really help MassDOT and the MBTA understand how to account for all those changes as we operate our services and as we make investments for the future.
The work of the Transportation Commission will be hugely influential on the future work of energy and environmental affairs, because currently transportation accounts for up to 40% of the greenhouse gas emissions across the Commonwealth. As we transition into a more electrified transportation fleet, this will be hugely helpful in us trying to meet the terms of our carbon reduction goals. The work will also help us to make the transportation network, the physical structures that exist today, be more resilient and more adapted to the forces of a changing climate.
Well, I think that transportation is really the cornerstone to our economy. You know, we have to move people, we have to move goods, we have to just make sure the economy thrives, and transportation is so critical to that. To me, the most exciting element of the Commission's work is the fact that we can look to the future and aspire to the transportation system that we all want.
We're excited and look forward to Massachusetts leading the way in planning for a bright transportation future. Share your thoughts and suggestions, and learn about our public engagement sessions at our website.
Thank you. It gives you an idea. Juliet knows that she's going first. I have just a brief introduction. Juliet Rooney-Varga is from UMass Lowell. She's the director of the UMass Lowell Climate Change Initiative, and she's an associate professor of environmental sciences. She has more than 20 years of experience as a research scientist, doing a whole bunch of things. Her recent work was funded by NASA and NSF and is focused on climate change education, communication, and decision support. She led the Climate Education in an Age of Media project. She's doing work now in collaboration with MIT Sloan School of Management, and she's currently leading the GeoInteractive project, which is developing, propagating, and researching the impact of interactive, simulation-based climate and energy education tools. So, Juliet, you have up to 10 minutes.
Great, thank you so much. This works. Can you all hear me?
Great.
Okay, great. I just want to start off, so I'm going to give you a little personal transportation story. I was actually, I had a biking accident last February due to the maybe not so great biking infrastructure in Lowell, and ended up on a medical leave and sort of woke up in what I felt like was a very different world later on that semester. And I guess I just want to start off by saying thank you. I feel like I am very grateful to be here, to be part of an effort, supporting an effort that is, as you say, looking to long-term, fact-based, rational, effective policymaking in a time when our news feeds are filled with a lot of spectacle and crisis, and maybe not so much focus on fact-based, effective policymaking that helps the people of the Commonwealth. So thank you for being here and for being part of this effort. I am going to start off very sort of 30,000 feet high, looking down at a high level about climate change, and just share a few of the facts that I think are important as we look to the future with both a changing climate and a changing economy as you all, as Massachusetts seeks to meet its goals in mitigating climate change. So I think that the people here, I don't need to tell you that the vast majority, over 97% of scientists agree that this problem is real. It's mostly bad for us. It's caused by human activity, primarily the use of fossil fuels. And there's an awful lot that we can do to lead the way to a better future. So I think that that's what we're here to do. On our current emissions trajectory, the National Climate Assessment sort of worst case scenario looks at by 2100 as much as 8 feet of sea level rise, which is sort of a hard thing to wrap your head around, potentially worse in the Northeast United States. My colleagues here, Paul and Rick, will I'm sure tell you more about specific impacts expected in Massachusetts. But I think that it's important for us to remember that it's not just impacts in Massachusetts. Even if we're able to protect the central artery, even if we're able to protect specific kinds of infrastructure here in the Bay State, we need to be thinking about what's happening elsewhere, because there will inevitably be people who are forced to migrate from elsewhere and looking for, as different areas are impacted before our areas are potentially, that will affect us. So that leads to something that the Pentagon refers to climate change on, which is a threat multiplier. We know that as climate change increasingly causes drought and failed crops, heat stress and public health problems, damage to our built and natural environments from extreme weather, that all of that fosters political instability. And while there's no current legal definition that I'm aware of climate refugee, we also know that the UN High Commissioner of Refugees estimates that 22.5 million people have been displaced by climate change related impacts since 2008, and that 500 million people in 2010, a World Gallup poll estimated that about 500 million people believe that they will be forced to leave their homes, their areas, within 5 years because of environmental disasters. So that's kind of the bad news. The good news is that there's a lot that we can do, and not only is there a lot that we can do, but I love the fact that we are thinking about something that goes out to 2040, but what we can do will not only benefit the future, but could also benefit the now. And I think that that's important to keep in mind. So we know that if the US actually stays in the Paris Accord and meets its pledges that it made in the Paris Agreement, that we can, by 2030, prevent 30,000 premature deaths. We could realize health benefits to the order of $1.2 trillion a year. And we know that Massachusetts is a leader in clean energy and energy efficiency in the US. So we have over 100,000 clean tech jobs, over 6,400 companies in this area, and these are good jobs with 75% of them earning more than $50,000 a year. I also want to comment that I think a lot of us especially those of us who love technology, get lulled into this idea that progress is inevitable, that new tech is going to come online, and we are making progress, and a lot of it is thanks to new technology, to improvements in technology. But the expectation is that that will not continue without further policy, as this commission is looking to enact. We are not expecting to see a continued decline, or so far we've benefited from the decline in costs of natural gas and renewable energy, and our emissions have come down. But we don't expect those trends to continue at the pace that we need them to continue without meaningful policy. So if we just kind of look at the big picture, we know that we have the science and technology that's needed to create policies that benefit the many. And now we need to actually leverage that knowledge. So we know, too, that we are privileged. Okay? We live in a time when science can provide a robust window into what potential futures will look like. We also know that past experience, so for most of our history, we've benefited by learning from past experience and using past experience as a guide for the future. We know that we can no longer do that. The past is no longer a reliable guide for the future. So I guess maybe you won't be surprised that I am, one of the key things that I have to say is that what we need to do is leverage that science, that scientific knowledge, for effective policymaking, and the only way we're going to do that is by engaging decision makers and the public, which, once again, grounded in factual reality, which I would say is the foundation of democracy, right? That's what it's about. so that we can address long-term problems and improve our well-being today and tomorrow. So just to wrap up, I think we have an opportunity to find real solutions to our problems instead of being distracted from those solutions. We have an opportunity to lead in the international community instead of retreating from it. And we have an opportunity to create the economy and jobs of the future instead of looking to something that maybe never was in the past. And when it comes to transportation, as we'll hear in more detail, I'm sure, what that means, I think, is to define our critical infrastructure as the infrastructure that we need for the future, right? The infrastructure that is low carbon transportation and that's resilient to future climate impacts. We need to invest heavily in public transit so that it's not just reliable, but desirable. We need to invest heavily in active forms of transit so that it's not seen as dangerous, but instead as enticing and a good way to get exercise. And we need to put a significant price on carbon that includes the transportation sector and ensure that the revenue that's collected goes to benefit the people. And that's, I just once again want to say thank you for being here.
Let's do all the speakers, and then I might come back with a follow-up question. So I want to introduce Paul now. Okay. So Paul Kirshen is from UMass Boston. Paul's a faculty member in the school. I should take that probably, shouldn't I? Thank you. Sorry. So I'm introducing Paul Kirshen. Paul is from UMass Boston. He's a faculty member in the School for the Environment at UMass Boston and co-academic director at the UMass Boston Sustainable Solutions Lab. He has over 30 years of experience. He's played a major role in the MassDOT analysis of potential impacts of the present and increased coastal flooding on the Central Artery in Boston, and he's currently working on the extension of that project to the entire Massachusetts coastline. He's an author of numerous reports, and he was the lead author for the U.S. National Climate Assessment. Paul.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, also with my UMass system colleagues. I'm going to talk about transportation and coastal flooding. Rick is going to be talking more about transportation and freshwater flooding. And since most of my work is dealing with roads, I'm really going to be focusing upon the impacts of increased coastal flooding and higher sea level rise on our coastal road network. So I want to start off by talking about what are the projections of sea level rise in the future, both now and then in 2050, and then talk about the possible impacts of flooding because of coastal storms, but also because of high tides, and then talk about some of the impacts of higher sea levels on our coastal groundwater levels and how that might impact the foundations of some of our coastal roads. So in terms of sea level rise, as Juliet pointed out, it's actually quite impossible to predict what's going to be our future sea level rise. But we think sometime between now and 2050, it's likely there to be 6 inches of sea level rise, or as much as 12 to 14 inches of sea level rise between now and 2050. It's possible it could have as much as 18 inches of sea level rise between now and 2050. And of course, this could grow to 7 or 8 feet by the end of the century under the worst case scenarios, the scenario we're on right now. In terms of higher tidal flooding, obviously if sea level is higher, our high tide's going to come in higher. And right now, in certain areas of the state along the coastline, we're facing what we call nuisance flooding. So every time there's a major high tide, like a king tide, it floods streets, it floods neighborhoods, it floods parts of the T, etc. And a recent analysis by a colleague at the University of New Hampshire, Jen Jacobs, found that presently 5% of Massachusetts roads, and that's measured by mileage, all classes of roads, are impacted by tidal and nuisance flooding. So 0.5% of all our roads right now in Massachusetts are impacted by this tidal and nuisance flooding. There's obviously going to grow in the future. And for example, right now Boston only gets about 6 days a year when we get this nuisance flooding. But by 2020, this number could grow from 6 to 10 to 40 times per year. And And then by 2060, it could actually be 53 to like 365 days a year. And so there's rapid increase in high tides. We're going to increase the percentage of roads that get flooded because there's nuisance flooding just because of high tide. In terms of coastal storms, obviously if sea level is higher, our coastal storms are going to come in higher. And we don't have detailed flood maps for all of Massachusetts, but as pointed out, UMass Boston has a contract with Mass DOT to develop projections of coastal flooding for all of Massachusetts, how it's going to impact the transportation network along the coast, and some adaptation or management strategies for that. But as also pointed out, in 2015, UMass Boston, working with some others, completed an analysis of climate change and potential increased coastal flooding on the Central Artery project in Boston. And there we found that, let's see here. Just for example, some of the impacts. So right now, only about, in the whole Central Artery project, only about 6 non-road structures, by that I mean vent buildings, pump stations, etc., are vulnerable to flooding for 100% storm now. But this may go to 25 structures by 2030. Okay, so impact of about 5 or 6 times increase in flooding of non-road structures. Also, let's see, we get roughly 1 foot of sea level rise by 2040 or so, and what this means is that the present 100-year flood, the frequency of the present 100-year flood between now and 2050 might, I'm sorry, the notes here. Okay. By around 2050 or so, the flood frequency of the present 100-year flood might become like a 50-year flood or even a 10-year flood. So an area that gets flooded now once in the average every 100 years might get flooded once in the average every 10 years or once every 50 years. There's just some sea level rise alone between now and let's say mid-century. The flooding, when a road gets flooded, obviously the road gets closed, but also can cause structural damage to the road. And before these roads can be open, oftentimes testing has to be done to the road. So you have these long delays after the flooding is receded just to make sure the road is safe. I'll talk a little bit about now also the impact of higher sea levels on coastal groundwater levels. Right along the coast, the fresh groundwater essentially sits on a layer of saltwater wedge under the land. So obviously as sea level rise goes up, this is going to push the groundwater up. And it's going to push the groundwater up, in many cases, into the foundations of our coastal roads and weaken the structure of the roads. And just an example of this, a student I'm working with looked at Route 286, which is an east-west road from Salisbury, Massachusetts to Seabrook, New Hampshire. Part of this road actually goes through a wetland. And there's a paper, this is from a work recently published in Transportation Research Board. She found that with 1 foot of sea level rise, this would raise the groundwater into the foundation of the road and decrease the surface life of the road by 80 to 90%. Okay? So 1 foot of sea level rise, which we could easily see by 2040, to go to the foundation of this road, Route 286, could decrease the surface life by 80 to 90%. So that's obviously not a desirable outcome. Now, this could be prevented, this damage to the road, if we took action right now to strengthen the top asphalt layer and also strengthen the foundation of the road. So what I've done is I've run through some of the impacts of increased sea level rise on our transportation network, primarily focusing on roads. And the threats come from higher tides, nuisance flooding, higher coastal storms, and then higher groundwater levels. And the management strategy for this, obviously the first management strategy is trying to control our greenhouse gas emissions, because that's going to lower our rates as silver rise. But unfortunately, because we can't reverse climate change right now, the most we can do is slow it down. We have to take adaptation action. And all the research has shown that it makes a lot more economic and social environmental sense to take adaptation action now, as opposed to waiting for the damages to occur and retroactively trying to repair and to take action then. And finally, I just want to point out that another theme as we're thinking about in terms of adaptation is, of course, the idea of equity, which is obviously another pillar of our democracy. Thank you very much.
Our last speaker is Rick Palmer from UMass Amherst. Rick is a professor in the department head of civil and environmental engineering at UMass Amherst. He's served in that role in the last 10 years. He's currently the university director of the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. It's one of 8 centers funded nationally by the U.S. Department of the Interior. And I think of note, only because we're close to Newport, is that he is an avid jazz enthusiast. So, Rick.
I was trying to make it personal. These introductions can be pretty boring. And I am very much an avid jazz enthusiast. I started as a music major. It was way too hard, so I switched over to engineering. And Steve, I have my clock going. I wanted to start out with a couple things. One is that I was invited to speak, and they waited until quite recently to tell me I couldn't use slides, which is sort of like a surprise. I feel like I need them. My slides, where are my slides? Second, I'm guilty. I drove here by myself. I tried to arrange a carpool, and I discovered they're going to arrive 2.5 hours early to set things up, and so I couldn't be part of the mitigation solution today. And then I just want to say that I have a French student living with me this summer, and he asked me where the fast train to Boston was. Isn't there a train that gets from Amherst to Boston in 30 minutes? And not yet. That was my answer. And also, in getting started, I want to thank Secretary Beaton and Assistant Secretary of Climate Change, Katie Doherty's, for their support for the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. So our center is called the Northeast Adaptation Climate Science Center. Adaptation has recently been added. So this is a federal center. I'm very happy that science hasn't been taken out of the name yet. NAR has climate. And I think this comes from the early stages of studying climate, where we talked about attribution, where does CO2 come from, mitigation and adaptation. So we're left with adaptation right now rather than mitigation or attribution. As was said, we're one of 8 major centers across the United States, and all of the universities in Massachusetts, my colleagues here have climate science research going on. I'll just mention we were also part of a NOAA large project, NOAA RISA, along with Columbia University and Drexel University, looking at the impacts of climate change on urban areas. So I just want to say a few words, and I think in Massachusetts these are maybe not as necessary as my original home state of Texas. I want to say that climate change is real. I don't know, I hope that doesn't raise any eyebrows. I want to say that climate models are not perfect, but climate models are quite useful in helping us to understand what may occur in the future, and in fact that they're getting better over time. And then I want to say a few words about what the future holds for us. If this was really a classroom setting, I would be asking you some questions right now. Like, what is the current level of CO2 in the atmosphere? Can anybody answer that? How many parts per million? About how many? 400. Perfect. 400 is the perfect answer. It's nice and round. So in 1920, our concentration of greenhouse gases were about 300 parts per million. By 2000, there were 360, and currently there are over 400. No one living will see them below 400 in the future. even the youngest person in this room will never see us go below 400 parts per million in the future. I moved here from Seattle 10 years ago. Summers are warmer here than in Seattle, it turns out. And so it's hard for me to compare what's happened over the last decade. But I can tell you the 5 warmest years on record globally have come in the 2010s. That means out of 2000 to 2017, the 5 hottest years on record have come since 2010, and in fact the 10 warmest years on record have come since 1998, and the 20 warmest records have come from 1995. This is a clear indication that our climate is changing and warming. So I work in the area of hydrology and water resources, and so we have this unfortunate positive feedback mechanism, right? As the climate gets warmer, more water evaporates. Warm air holds more water than cold air. You can think of water vapor also as a greenhouse gas. And so as it warms, there's more water vapor, and therefore there is more change, and it can hold more water, and it exaggerates or excites the water cycle. So we're going to see the sort of things that Paul mentioned: larger storms, more frequent storms, and more intensive rainfall in the future. Really, the estimates are that if in the future, for any 1% change that in degrees temperature that is attributable to CO2, you'll get another degree change just due to increased water vapor in the air. Okay, well, what can we expect? Well, everyone talks about how long is it going to take to change the temperature by 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, no one asks that question. No one, really what they ask is how long does it take before we increase our temperatures by 2 degrees centigrade, and when you change that to Fahrenheit is 3.6. So we ran at our center a bunch of climate models, 34 climate models. We wanted to make sure we were giving good answers, so we asked the question, when do 80% of the models say we're going to increase by at least 2 degrees centigrade? So it's not the worst, it's not the most scary model, it's 80% of the models. And the answer was quite interesting. Globally, 2 degrees change is going to occur in 2060, globally. Across the US, it's going to occur in 2045, sooner. Guess who wins? The Northeast. We're predicting by the year 2040, climate will change by 2 degrees centigrade in the Northeast. Another way to think about that is living in the Northeast, by the end of this century, will have about the same heat intensity, that includes humidity and temperature, as living in the Carolinas. You'll tell stories to your grandchildren about snow that they don't experience living here. Think about that. Think about the snow in the Carolinas and think about what we experience currently. Again, we expect a lot of change in extreme precipitation. There's been lots of studies of this, not forecasts, but studies. And it's been estimated since the early 1900s, the increase in the largest storms in our region have increased by 40%. So the biggest rainfall events have increased by almost 40% in this region. It's hard to imagine what that means until you do a bunch of modeling and trying to figure out what's going on. So in terms of flooding, there's probably 2 ways to think about this. So obviously floods impact our transportation system in ways that Paul mentioned. So you can think about every bridge, every culvert, every road that is currently not in a floodplain that could be in the floodplain, and also all the infrastructure that lies along the roads close to a floodplain. So I'll suggest 2 ways of thinking about this. What we're looking at is that the 1 in 100-year flood in many of the streams across Massachusetts is going to increase by as much as 30%. So if you were getting a flood that had whatever unit, let's don't use metric, let's use English. If it had a flow of 50,000 cubic feet per second, that flow could be closer to 60,000 or 65,000 cubic feet per second. So that's one way of looking at it. And another way to look at it is to say that a 1 in 100-year flood today is likely to be more like a 1 in a 50-year flood in the future. So places which were flooded very rarely will become flooded much more often. Now this will be impacted by the type of stream it is, how large it is, and other features. But we've looked at 120 sites across the state of Massachusetts, and we have numbers that reflect that. So this is going to have really large infrastructure impacts. Infrastructure built near rivers or near streams that we thought were not flood prone are going to be flood prone. Bridges that will be exposed to much larger and more frequent storms. If design is not changed, they're going to have impacts on those bridges. Roads that never went underwater, as Paul mentioned, are going to be going underwater in the future. I have more good news. On the other end of the extremes, we actually expect more droughts. How can you have more droughts when it rains more? Well, the biggest changes in rainfall we're expecting are in the December, January, and February periods. And it's not too complicated, but you'll have some snow, you'll have warm rain on snow, larger rainstorms, and more floods. But in the summer, you have all of June, July, and August, and particularly September and October, where you've had warmer and warmer temperatures and less groundwater perhaps going back into the system. And then by that late summer, early fall, the streams are extremely dry. So we anticipate much more conflicts between people who make use of the water in the stream and outside the stream. In late summers, there could be higher demands on hydropower, but less water available for hydropower. And we're not forecasting this for every summer and every situation, but these things are going to become more common. Policy changes, I think we're going to see some very significant emphasis on making sure that the 1 in 100-year flood that you design for in terms of transportation systems is more carefully calculated. As Paul mentioned, the state hasn't updated its 100-year floodplains. When they do, they should not be looking at the past 100 years to make that estimate. They need to be looking at forecast and model runs of what conditions are likely to be in the future. Simple culvert design, culverts designed just to keep smaller roads open and free and safe. The hurricanes we've suffered in recent years are an indication of what can happen if culverts and bridges are under-designed. And so we're going to be looking, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of investigation in improving that design process. And my phone didn't go off, but I think I'm pretty close, Steve, to the 10 minutes. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you all. I want to ask one question for all of you, and we'll go in reverse order. So we'll start with Rick. And you have here a good part of this commission, and if there was and it's not a message, but it could be a message, but if you had 1 or 2 recommendations that you would like to see the commission make to the governor and other decision makers, what might that be? And that could be an action that relates to something now. But please remember, our charge is to look out and then to make decisions to help provide some principles and guidelines that we might do now for the future. So we'll go Rick, Paul, and then Juliet.
Okay, great. So I had meant to say this in my talk. So when we talk about climate, we never talk about a single decade or even 2 decades. So we talk about multiple decades in the future. So despite the fact that looking forward 20 years is a wonderful challenge and very interesting, in terms of climate, my recommendation would be, as soon as you're done, start again and look further into the future. We make infrastructure investments for at least 30 years and typically more 50 years. So things we design today that we want to go on for 50 years have to include future climate for them to be really functional and safe. So I'll leave it at one message.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
I mentioned a couple of things before. One, obviously, continue to control emissions. That's been said quite a bit. The other thing is focus on equity. The most socially vulnerable populations are going to suffer the most from climate change. And their transportation network is particularly important to them because they usually need to get to work, whereas many of us who are more professional can usually work from home, so consider equity. But the third point is, and this sort of gets to Rick's point, is we have to think about adapting our infrastructure and design for the future. Don't design for using present design conditions. Think ahead 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And because we're uncertain of what our future climate's going to be, think about solutions, adaptation strategies that are flexible and adjustable, that we can adjust over time as the climate changes. So this might be as simple as designing a bridge that can be elevated over a stream as the flood level of that stream increases over time. It might be thinking about designing a road where you realize that eventually the foundation might be flooded by higher sea levels. So when we rebuild that road today, let's make a stronger foundation. Let's make it possible to adjust it over time as the climate changes. And I'm not arguing right now for overbuilding everything. I'm just saying design our infrastructure so it can be flexible, so as the climate changes, we can make the changes. And this is not rocket scientists. It's rocket science. I mean, civil engineering profession and all professions know a great deal about making infrastructure flexible and adjustable over time. And yeah, so thank you. And also I want to point out that there's a long history of making transportation adjustable to population changes. And like the George Washington Bridge, it's really designed to be just one tier of a road. But you look at it now, it's got 2 tiers. So when they built that bridge, they said, okay, eventually we want to be able to add on to it. So let's make the piers and the foundation strong enough so when the demand doubles, we just add another road onto it. So we know how to do this. We just need to be given the opportunity to do it. Thank you.
Okay, so yeah, thanks. And I'm also going to kind of reiterate something that I said already, but I think that's really important. We've heard from both Rick and Paul and me that the future does not look like the past, right? We're talking about some pretty major changes here, and in some ways some things that are unrecognizable to us. So with that in mind, we need to remember that the past is no longer a guide for past experience, is no longer a guide for the future. So science must be, and we're grateful to have that. We're also hearing about really major actions or policies in order to make this future happen, in order to create a thriving Commonwealth in 2040, right? We're hearing about the fast train from Amherst to Boston, okay, which isn't going to happen without some pretty major action, right? We're hearing about public transit. We're hearing about active transportation. We're hearing about adaptation to make our roads resilient to the changes that are coming. So I think none of that is going to happen. These big changes are not going to happen without the public being on board. And so I think that despite the fact that this is the Future of Transportation Commission, I would ask you to think very hard about the fact that education and what I mean by education is not like what I do lecturing to a class. What I mean by education is the translation. Has anybody heard of the idea of translational medicine or translational biology? It's the idea of translating science into something that society can use. And that's what I think we really need, that it needs to lay the groundwork for this vision of a thriving transportation system in the future of the Commonwealth.
Those are terrific. Thank you all. Thank you all for the time. I hope you'll stay. You don't need to stay. The brownies look terrific if you want to break. This next piece, we go in order, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so forth. And so if you wanted to speak, you would have signed up at the front desk and you would have gotten a little card with the number on it, and we'll go in that order. If you didn't do that and would like to speak, you can still go to the registration desk and do that. So please remember 3 minutes. Ideally, we'd like you to focus on the climate and resiliency topic, but you're welcome to speak about any topic related to transportation. And please introduce who you are, and if you're where you're from, and if you're speaking from an organization. And who has the number what spot? Excellent. Okay, that mic should work. And don't expect questions from the panel. We really are here to listen. However, any of the panel members may do a follow-up question. So thank you.
Great. Hello, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. My name is Catherine King, and I'm from Norwell. I go to Colby College, and this summer I have the privilege to be interning as a public policy intern with MassPIRG. MassPIRG is the Massachusetts Public Interest Research Group. It's a consumer group that stands up to powerful interests whenever they threaten our health and safety, our financial security, or our right to fully participate in our democratic society. Using the time-tested tools of investigative research, media exposes, and grassroots organizing, MassPIRG delivers concrete results for the citizens of Massachusetts. It supports the transition to a clean and accessible 21st century transportation system where walking, biking, and transit options are robust, where there are fewer cars on the road, and where the air is cleaner and people are healthier. As you all know, climate change impacts are becoming the most likely and greatest threat to our future. The last 3 years have all broken heat records, rising cities continue to threaten our cities, extreme weather is all around us, and public health is now at the discretion of the amount of GHGs we put into the air. Transportation is the root of all of these problems. It is the largest source of pollution. I share this because we need to take action now, because inaction is no longer an option. The fact is, we need more ideas about how we can actually speed up the adoption of a transportation system with zero emissions, while at the same time, we need to give people options beyond their cars. One option is RGGI for transportation. RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, is a bipartisan regional effort to cap and reduce CO2 emissions from the power sector, and then to use this revenue generated to invest in fueling the growth of renewable energy. It's already generated billions of dollars that the states have used to invest in improving the energy efficiency of many homes and businesses. So this makes it pretty clear that climate leadership has started with RGGI. We should use these lessons learned and extend them to transportation. As you know, Massachusetts has ambitious goals to reduce its emissions between 29% and 40% by 2030. But if we don't figure out something for transportation, we are not going to get there. So we are suggesting that Massachusetts, along with other states in the region, implement a market-based cap and invest program just like RGGI that would work for transportation. What would this look like? It would require putting a descending cap on transportation emissions. The cap would be placed on fuel importers. The revenue raised from the tax would be used toward real climate benefits, but specifically and more importantly, toward carbon-free transportation investments. This would include the repair and expansion of current transit systems, charging infrastructure necessary for the widespread adoption of electric vehicles, as well as the renewable sources to power them, and new modes of transportation that would reduce our reliance on cars. We need to build a transportation system for 21st century needs. This requires climate-resilient infrastructure, and we need to figure out how to pay for it. The revenue from RGGI is the answer. This would create greater resiliency and reliability in all of our commutes, and we just need to look to California to know that this already works. In summary, Massachusetts is already part of a regional group called TCI, Transportation Climate Initiative. Those states all want to do something, and this is that something. Incentivizing this market-based cap and invest program for transportation could solve the problem of congestion and emissions. Moreover, it would put ourselves on a path toward a better transportation system and a more livable climate. This means a better quality of life. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Number 2, or any questions? Number 2? Number 3?
Hi, my name's Frank Singleton. I'm a Weymouth Conservation Commission member. I'm also retired as a health director of Lowell for 15 years, so I've got a lot of experience in other states as well. But I'm here to speak on a subject matter that, as a member of the Conservation Commission and someone who also was part of the original 71 communities that received the municipal vulnerability grants, and the mayor put me as the project manager because I was the one that came up with the idea of applying for it. I'm seeing a steady stream of projects come before us, but we're dealing with a very conservative problem is engineering, in which we're using precipitation. Where's NOAA 14 instead of TR 40? Where are the new standards that have to be put in play? everybody comes before us, whether it's a state highway project, new culvert design, stormwater protection, etc., is faced with, they go to the manual. They basically say what the existing system is, and we have to follow that as a commission, even though we know we're undersizing and not building appropriately to reflect the next 20 years or the next 30 years. So my plea would be is somehow this commission has got to get the code system up to speed to reflect the changes and be able to let people like the conservation commissions dealing with these applicants coming before us deal with the reality of what we're dealing with. And of course, it's going to cost more money. It's going to change whether or not something can be done in some cases. But it's very frustrating to sit there and listen to the past as prologue rather than the future. And I'm just making a plea for where's the stormwater? DEP's been sitting on that now, the new stormwater regulations. We need to get those things in place, or people like myself who have the expertise and knowledge faced with the Conservation Commission work plan before us are sitting there having to approve projects we know are undersized, but that's because the law mandates that we have to do it that way.
Very helpful, thank you. Number 4. I'm going to go back. Does number 2 want to speak now? Number 5. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Ilse Green with Solar One Solutions in Needham, Massachusetts. About 10 years ago, Boston launched a pilot program where they endeavored to build an evacuation route using off-grid infrastructure like solar-powered traffic lights, lighting, gas pumps, and the like. At that time, the equipment was, and the technology was very immature and expensive. Today, I can speak for solar lighting. The technology has matured a great deal. It's flood tolerant. It continues to work when the power is out, and it can be networked with wireless networks. It also, from a lighting point of view, the lighting is better and cheaper than it has been in the past. And the proof is with cities and DOTs across the country that are employing it and working it into their projects. One example that I'd like to give is the New York DOT for the Long Island Welcome Center. They built this Welcome Center to be a rest stop, as well as a market for the local farmers and vendors and the like. But it's also an emergency shelter, so that the building itself has a lot of off-grid features for emergencies. And then, of course, on the exterior, selfishly, there's solar lighting to light up the area as well as the route into the shelter area. So that's all I have to say. I hope that that's part of your plans in the future.
Thank you very much. Number 6.
Hi, here we go. Thank you for welcoming us here today. My name is Lloyd Mendes. I'm from the town of Somerset. I'm the town's Serpent Commissioner of the Southeastern Regional Planning and Economic Development, but my remarks are my own. I'm also a member of the town's Economic Development Committee. I want to talk about, and because of my economic development interest, I'm here to talk mostly about industrial transportation. And I'm focused only on adaptation, not mitigation. I'd like you to look at the designated port area authority you have. It's a form of state zoning that allows you to kind of protect land for its future industrial use. But I want you to think about tweaking it. As one of our, as Professor Vargas pointed out, the past isn't a good representation of the future nowadays. Designated port area authority allows us only to look at the past and current uses, but you might want to tweak it to allow us to look at expected, predicted future limitations on land use. For example, they draw designated port area boundaries now in order to link with current highways and current rail. Well, if the current rail is displaced because of flooding, the new rail position will maybe be further uphill. So perhaps we should expand our designated port areas to protect that land. Because, like, I'll give you an example. In the town of Somerset, we are so severely built up from the 1950s that a lot of our options are totally foreclosed. But once people have homes along the interstate, you are never going to redesign highways because there's just too much political opposition. The only way to leave options open for people who come after us is to protect some of this land, because we know that you're going to need new access routes to the rail. You're going to need new access routes to the highway. Some of our designated port areas may be worthless. If we consider right now, some of them will just be wetlands. So maybe we can write them off now and start protecting them. Allow some private developer to waste his money on them. I think that's it. And I would like to point out that the beauty of something like zoning, like state zoning in designated port areas, is that it doesn't force us to overbuild now. It simply leaves our options open. We don't know what the future's going to be like. There's no point in spending billions of dollars to build structure now. Let's just leave the land open for future options. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Please, Tim.
Thank you. Just to build on that concept, I was wondering if the panelists could speak to this. As we talk about adaptation, we can't adapt to every scenario, and some of your scenarios were pretty extreme. And I have a bias here, admittedly coming from an inland location. In what areas is it likely we simply restructure what we do as opposed to adapt what we do to the change that's happening? In other words, is there some change that you see that we just can't fight and therefore we move around from? Or do you think technology and money are there to address any change that might happen?
I'll add one thing right there quickly. I think as soon as we complete our municipal vulnerability plan assessment across the Commonwealth and get every community in, I think we'll have a much better understanding of at least how to conceptualize that and understand that. That's really sort of the point of what we're trying to understand is what is the scope of what we're up against. Some areas, I think it's going to be very site-specific and very resource-specific as to what the physical dynamics are and the changes are as it affects, economics and where people live in industrial zones or wherever it may be. The statewide look that we're engaging in right now is very much geared towards trying to help us understand what those challenges will be on what scale in a specific area, allowing for an individual approach to be taken in that area, recognizing we can't just do a broad brush across the entire Commonwealth because of the variety of coastal versus inland, riverine, wherever it may be, wherever the community is or the region is that we're looking at.
Okay, do you want to go ahead? I'll say them. Sure. I probably shouldn't stick my neck out, but I think when we've had like 5 feet of level rise, it's going to be very difficult to protect Boston from coastal flooding. And we have to think about different ways of managing flooding. Moving away from the coast, living with water. We just can't have a walled city. And the second thing is, our coastal wetlands. They've been endangered for hundreds of years. They're going to be continually endangered by higher sea levels, and many of them are going to be turned into open water. And we're going to lose, the billions of dollars of ecosystem services that wetlands provide. And you mentioned, zoning. So one thing we're going to start thinking about is somehow reserving land for our wetlands so to try to migrate inland. So how are we going to do that? And in terms of transportation, these wetlands are really important. They help break down, help break up wave impacts. So you think about all the roads along, all the Route 1 north of Boston. They borders all those beautiful wetlands. We lose those wetlands, those roads are going to be endangered a lot more. The third thing is, and Julie had already alluded to this, we're already seeing environmental refugees, both globally and we're going to start seeing them within the U.S. And right, exactly right. But I was thinking, like, many of the people that fled the harsh climate of Massachusetts are now going to be coming back because it's going to be a more attractive place to live than living in the southwestern or southeast United States. So we're going to have our own internally generated climate refugees, but also, broad bands of the equator are not going to be livable. And those people are going to have to move somewhere. And they're going to be moving, north or south. And because the world's interconnected, There's no way we're not going to be impacted the way Europe is right now by these refugees from other parts of the world. And so I think if you're thinking ahead, 20, 30, 40 years, we've got to think about these scenarios and these impacts outside just Massachusetts.
So just a couple of add-ons there. So I think I agree with Paul that there are some places, there are places where retreat makes sense, right? Where it's like it doesn't make sense to try to have a walled city. It's not gonna work in the long run. But the good news is we have some time to prepare for that, and we can do it in a way that's ordered and fair if we plan ahead. I think, and that's not true everywhere, right? There are places where we can adapt. I think that one thing that I would just say is like a guiding principle is that it's very tempting when there's a storm or some kind of extreme event that knocks out our infrastructure, or when we're planning in our Executive Order 569, when all of our various municipalities are planning for, what's our critical infrastructure that we need to protect? Well, the first inclination that people have is to protect the infrastructure that's critical today. But that infrastructure is fossil fuel-based infrastructure, and that's not where we need to go, right? We're going to have a lot more refugees coming in from the outside if we don't address this global problem of global emissions. So we need to think about basically having clear in our minds, like defining what is the critical infrastructure for tomorrow, not today. Where are we going? And I loved the story about the solar lights, because this is something where there are many opportunities for synergies between mitigation and adaptation. Why are we talking about them separately? They should be combined into united efforts to create a future where we're thriving, right? Like, we have opportunities with a more distributed, just this morning I was hearing on the radio about Isle of Howe in Maine, right? This little tiny island off the coast of Maine, which is going to have a smart microgrid in order to be resilient and have zero emissions. Like, why don't we have that? All of these towns in Massachusetts could have microgrids. So I would just encourage us to be thinking about both critical infrastructure redefined as what we want for the future, not the past, and looking for those opportunities where we can build resilience, adaptation, and mitigation with single actions, not actions that are siloed from each other.
Can I add something? Go ahead.
Thank you. Just a really quick comment. And one is that there's still some low-hanging fruit out there, right? I mean, we don't have to change everything at once. And I just think of culverts as an example, which blow out every year and are replaced. And so no one's, we don't want to make this job bigger than it is. No one would go in and try to exchange all culverts throughout the state in 1 year. But as you move through time, you use the best data that you have available about today and the future to design those. And so you take the ones which are most clearly either have failed or most clearly under-designed and replace those. And then you have another year or two to consider the next step, and you have new data. So you're constantly getting to this adaptive management concept in your head that we think climate is changing, we're going to make changes that have the best benefit cost analysis associated with them today, and then we'll move to the next decision. Even though individual towns have to make decisions about one piece of infrastructure, the state has the ability sort of to look at the entire region as a whole and pick those actions that will have the most benefit in the short term and the long term. So the comment was made, there were some pretty dire predictions. I think some of those dire predictions are going to be accurate, and we just need to be thinking about how to update our sustainable systems as best we can. So,
well, just going to add another comment. We've got to start. We've got to stop thinking in terms of silos. For example, in terms of adaptation, there's some things that can be done that would protect the assets of many organizations. So, for example, I'm doing a lot of work right now in East Boston, and one of the threats in East Boston is flooding to the Callahan and Sumner tunnels. Well, we need to take individual actions to protect those tunnels from flooding by putting gates on them, Or we can think broader and say, okay, let's block off right along the coast where the floodwaters come from. And if we do that, we're also going to protect the assets of the other agencies that also have assets in East Boston, like the city, like power stations, substations, and so on. And also we'll protect, homes of residents and businesses of residents. But it requires, coordination among multiple agencies that have assets in an area. And that requires, a new way of governance, a new way of thinking, and also new ways of financing. But I think it's the only way we're going to be able to economically deal with the consequences of climate change is think more about interagency cooperation, interagency financing. Because if every agency tries to go it alone, it's going to be just too expensive and ineffective. But if we work together across agencies, across cities, we can capture economies of scale, and we can really have cost-effective adaptation, particularly in the short run, to 2030 or so.
That's a great point. And one thing I want to point out in the way I described in a finite amount of time earlier, the work underway under Governor Baker's executive order. I mentioned the MVP program. That's our partnership with municipalities to reach out into the communities, create a workshop, a bunch of new tools that the folks at the Climate Science Center helped us build to give communities the opportunity to do these assessments in a way that can be sort of replicated and spoken apples to apples across communities, all brought into one larger scope to what the municipalities are up against. In addition to that, the executive order did exactly what you just mentioned. Governor Baker had the foresight to understand that this isn't just an issue facing the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. All of our secretariats need to play a role in this and need to partner in this effort. And as a result of that thinking, each secretariat has put forward a climate change coordinator in that secretariat that's largely responsible of working with all of the agencies inside the jurisdiction of each secretariat to help sort of extract this information and sort of be the lead of a lot of the things that are specific to the body of work under the jurisdiction of that secretariat. Because I am no expert on health and human services or public safety, but particularly public safety with MEMA being our co-chair with Katie's leadership, co-chairing this initiative, obviously because they play such an important role in working with FEMA, but just in their already existing hazard mitigation plans. We're unifying the hazard mitigation plan with the climate adaptation plan, creating one sort of unified document in a partnership with MEMA at the head of this, but then also every other secretariat providing input to it. So as we look to not only just expand, a lot of the grant programs that we're going to have through our climate action grants and new things coming, hopefully soon with the environmental bond bill that's being passed, but also the work that's currently underway. And how can we look at the grants we're doing now and make sure that they are in line with that forward view of what we think the adaptations need to be considered for the grants that we do today, and how do we change those to sort of have that forward-looking vision. So your comments really struck a good chord with me, because that's precisely the way we're trying to think about it, and great to hear that. I guess at least in your eyes, we're on the right track. I guess.
No, it's even great to hear you're doing it. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Number 7.
I'm Charlie Myers. I'm the chair of the Massachusetts Fuel Cell Electric Vehicle Working Group. I'm a member of the Rhode Island ZEV Working Group, president of the Massachusetts Hydrogen Coalition, and a member of our town's Green Community Energy Committee as well. So a variety of hats. I want to shift a little bit. I'm keeping the focus on the climate resilience and sustainability part of it. As transportation electrifies, which we know it will do, there's going to be an interesting nexus between the energy source used for transportation and the energy source that we're going to be using in our structures for our houses and our buildings for that electricity. Interesting analogy that has happened is Japan, when they lost their nuclear power plant, Fukushima, due to a tsunami, turned to the auto industry and said, we want you to use fuel cell electric vehicles and battery electrics as backups to the grid, so that you can actually plug your house into it. So they turned transportation into an energy storage medium. So as we look forward in the years 2040, 2050, out in the future, transportation will actually become an energy storage platform for us. So therefore, the mode of fuel that we use for transportation starts to become important on it. And how much time it takes to replenish that fuel into the vehicle under what circumstances has a direct bearing on its energy storage capabilities and backup to us. Hydrogen is a fuel that can be made any number of different ways on it, but it allows vehicles to be refueled, a car in 5 minutes, a bus in 15 minutes. Buses will do hundreds of kilowatts of energy per hour, and in Japan, Toyota's already demonstrated that they are using fuel cell buses to actually power gymnasiums and emergency shelters and things like that. A Toyota Mirai, which is their car, will provide 9 kilowatts of power for 5 days off of 1 tank of hydrogen if you plug it in, and refueled in 5 minutes. So imagine either the bus or the car leaving the scene of an emergency situation, going out and being refilled and back again in 15 minutes on it. And so hydrogen, which can be made in a variety of ways, renewably, wind, solar, biofuels, and such, can be made locally. And so as we look at our economy here and we think of transportation, we're thinking of a fuel that can be made locally in state. As we look at trains, there's fuel cell trains now that are in operation. There are fuel cell buses in operation. In fact, the T actually had one running between Linden and Sullivan Square this past year. So there's a resilience element about making the fuel locally from a number of different sources. Now, as we go in the duck curve and we start looking at the utility shapes of things and curtailment of energy, we could be transferring that curtailment into making hydrogen, storing the hydrogen, using it for energy storage, putting it into transportation on it. So this nexus starts to become even more interesting on things. Hydrogen stations can be islanded for power so that they're not shut down during power outages on it. A battery electric vehicle is actually one that when it runs out of power, if your grid is down, where do you get the electricity for that battery electric vehicle to recharge it versus going to a hydrogen station and refueling on it? So my suggestion would be that as we look at sustainability, fuel source should be part of the equation, and particularly one that can be made locally from wind, solar, and hydro. And hydrogen certainly fulfills that need to it. So just a suggestion on that as well. And for those of you that want to, I will tell you that I actually drove down here today in a fuel cell car, a Honda Clarity. I'm getting my fuel out of Mansfield and Providence, and I will hang around in the parking lot. So there's a white 4-door Honda there that's a fuel cell vehicle. I'll be glad to show anybody after the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Thank you. Number 8.
Hi, my name is Joyce DeBona. I'm a resident of Boston and have been for the last 54 years. I am also on the board of Walk Boston, which is a nonprofit promoting safe walking throughout the communities of Massachusetts. But I'm here to speak for myself, or on my own, I should say. I've walked to work for 40 years in the city of Boston. And I live right in the city of Boston. And fortunately, about 30 years ago, I found a wonderful home in Westport where I escaped. And it literally is an escape these days. Boston has just become overgrown, overcongested, and not a pleasant place to live anymore. I know my real estate has, I would say, 8 times has increased in value, so I'm very pleased that way. But when I see what's going on down at the seaport, without any concern for livability and every other aspect, and I think of Logan Airport over in East Boston as a major engine of the economy of Massachusetts, is probably going to disappear in 10 or 15 years, maybe even sooner, because of the water and the climate situation. So I just wonder, maybe you can pass along my concern, and I'm not alone in the city, that where is the concern or the raising of questions of how can we overbuild a city that is quite small when you consider we're one of the top 10 cities in the United States. How can there be no lack of just concern for overbuilding? And it's just putting pressure on everything, let alone the climate. So that's my comment.
Thank you very much. Number 9. Number 2 or number 4? Number 10? I don't know how many numbers we have. Okay. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Heather Hamilton. I'm a select board member for the town of Brookline, but I will be speaking for myself. I just want to say, just based on what I've been hearing, that CO2 does not abide by jurisdiction, and yet a lot of our planning is by jurisdiction. So I just wanted to kind of echo the comments of the gentleman from his own Conservation Commission and those from the Commission, that funding is going to be a key part of helping us to plan for a lot of these things. The other thing that I want to point out is I think we actually have a lot more in common, the communities, than we have differences. So I know that there were some remarks saying, you know, some of us have coastal flooding, but some of us are more inland communities. I think we need to start thinking more regionally, and if we can use something like the Mass Municipal Association or you know, MEMA, any other kind of more state and regional planning to bring communities together, then we'll realize that we have a lot more in common and at stake than our own jurisdictions. The other thing I want to say, when you get lemons, I like to try to make lemonade. So I actually look forward to seeing the synergy that will happen with all of these challenges within the town of Brookline's health department and DPW and building department to try to address these issues all together, because it's going to require all of these disciplines to share information and to be on the same page. Thank you.
Please, Karen.
If I can add to your comment, I represent one of 13 regional planning agencies, and so one of the things we're focused on, because the state had the foresight to allow us to do this, was to become an MVP provider. So not only can we be one of the providers helping our communities, but we can share this information amongst the other RPAs. So there will be, as we proceed with this, we're really only a few months into it, but we will have shared economies of experiences, really.
Thank you very much, Karen. That was something I wanted to share as well. I think part of the strategy, particularly with our MVP program, was reaching out to the regional planning commissions and having them be sort of leads and partners and trying to engage in regional conversations. One of the things that we first need to do is understand inside of each community, down on the DPW level, the Parks Director level, the Fire Chief level, understand what are the things in each community, get those things and that information and that really just like catalog for us to have an understanding of what are the needs inside of the communities, and then take a step back and try to look at this from a regional perspective with the information and the climate projection data inside a specific watershed, thinking about it, knowing that, you know, climate change doesn't care if you're in Brookline or Cambridge or wherever. We need to start thinking of what are these effects going to be inside a watershed or inside a certain region that might have similar effects, or communities that might have this similar challenges, and how do we work with those communities to develop a plan to help them. So we are very much engaged, and a lot of that work is on the, you know, the regional planning authority level, but, you know, engaging with all stakeholders, whether it's you know, folks like the Nature Conservancy helping us to also engage in those conversations, or MAPC, and really thinking about it on that larger level. But right now we're really at that grab the data level and grab the information and understand the scope to help us then step back and develop a plan.
Heather, were you number 10?
Yes.
Okay, number 11?
Hi, Jordan Studd, Carbon Programs Director at Acadia Center. We are a clean energy research and advocacy organization based in our Boston office. First, thank you to the commissioners and to Secretary Beaton for hosting this meeting. Thank you to the UMass panel for your presentations today. They were really great. As the state grapples with the future of transportation and seeks to identify strategies to reduce CO2 emissions from the largest source of emissions in the state, to modernize and to harden transportation infrastructure that is severely outdated in many cases, and to ensure that our network of transportation options is accessible to everybody in Massachusetts, it's clear that we need a robust policy package to achieve those goals. One particular policy that is of great appeal that we've already heard about today is the idea of a cap and invest program for the transportation sector. An earlier commenter already described the benefits of that kind of policy in detail, so I won't repeat those, but I will note that it's a policy that received a great deal of support through the listening sessions that were held by Massachusetts back in the fall, through listening sessions that have been held across the region through the Transportation Climate Initiative, and recently it's gotten support from companies like National Grid and from industry groups like AIM in Massachusetts. So for those reasons, I would urge the Commission to include this kind of policy in its scenario analysis as it looks forward. I would also note that it can be difficult to model all the complex outcomes from this kind of policy. So I might suggest that adjusting assumptions to account for these kinds of potential impacts could be an alternative route there, potentially by adjusting the assumed cost of transportation fuels to account for carbon content, by adjusting the available resources that the state has to invest in transportation improvements and decarbonization strategies. And finally, I would note that technological advances will absolutely help us achieve our climate goals. But what we know is that those technological advancements often fail to deliver benefits equitably across society. So if we truly want to achieve an equitable, low-carbon future of transportation, we can't just rely on technology. We also have to make sure that we are putting the policy framework in place to achieve those goals. Thank you.
Thank you, Jordan. Number 12.
I'm Andrea Langhauser with the town of Easton. I'm their assistant planning director. I want to thank you, Secretary Beaton, for the MVP award this year. We're looking forward to not just doing our own plan, but we also have a number of adjoining communities, and so that we're looking to maximize our final workshop by doing a regional workshop, and I think it's going to go very well in the upper Taunton River. I also want to thank you for contracting with the 2 offshore wind contracts here in the area, and for the infrastructure that you put in place in New Bedford, because renewable energy is going to make a difference, and we should use our wind. It's right here.
Right.
The good thing about coming last is that a lot of people have already said the things that I wanted to say, but I really wanted to identify the importance of low-hanging fruit. That it's great. There's a lot of people here with a lot of vision, and we need that, but we also need to make progress. And Weymouth understands that there's a lot of local development that comes from this, a lot of local development regulation that comes from the state, and that you could update those regulations and make it a lot easier for us to do our job. The easy thing, like how do you forecast a storm for your stormwater, is incredibly simple. It already exists. It's already there. It's not in the regulations. We'd like it to be. Culvert. We already have. Culverts are one of the main things that are going to keep our nuisance flooding from being a problem. And there already is a stream continuity database that is located in UMass, I think, but it's across the state. And I know from that database that there are 50 culverts in the town of Easton, and 1 or 2 of them are really significant for replacement. I can get that information to my DPW, but the state hopefully will use this plan to set goals, to say that if we do the right thing at the local level, we will get benefit from it. That tell us how you want us to grow, and then give us incentives to do it. Water transportation. How come nobody mentioned water transportation? We got to get on the water. It's coming. We might as well use it. All of the best water transportation in downtown Boston came from mitigation through highway projects. As the highways were being constructed, the water transportation routes went into place. That's how we got the Boston downtown to Charlestown. That's how we got out to Quincy, that's how we got out to Hingham. We've got to put more money into our water transportation, because you actually get, you can ask Secretary Pollock about this, people will pay more money and it costs less per ridership to go on a water transportation than it does on subways, and we love it. We love water transportation, right? We love water transportation. Okay, leave it at that.
I'm going to ask you to support Governor Baker's language in the environmental bond bill for a water transportation trust fund.
Yes!
Before the legislature right now.
Okay.
Number 13? Or are you last? Did
I
you
think I
declare
think
that
we're
you were last, or are you last?
No, I wanted to wrap it up.
Is there anybody else, having heard this, that would like to speak that hasn't spoken yet? Please, yeah.
My name is Paul Shue. I work with Peer Environmental Consulting, but I'll relate back a little bit before that. I spent 30 years as a city manager, and 3 of the communities I manage were coastal communities, 1 a river community. So many of the things you were saying were just hitting home quite well. But I wanted to thank you in particular, and I know the municipal vulnerability assessments and everything, but I really liked your panel. I thought you had a great panel. And that what they did is they talked about a really complicated, controversial topic in a pretty plain way. And that's really what you do at the local level. If you're a city manager, it's hard to sell this stuff locally, especially when you talk about extending lifetimes and building in flexibility in your systems and low-hanging fruit items. So thank you very kindly. That was a great, and I just came back from Ohio dealing with DOT there. I was thinking, how it struck me in the 30 years I've managed cities, how different the role is of the Department of Transportation today than when I started managing cities. You know, when you started then, I don't say stagecoaches, but it was, you know, it was transportation, how much more traffic can you push through a place, et cetera. The Department of Transportation in Ohio is using hyper GPS, and they run a lot of the farming in the state from the Department of Transportation. The farmers rely on running the tractors because the tractors, the combines, and all the stuff that produce the food that we eat don't need drivers. They have a driver because they have to, but they sit there and they watch their instruments run the whole show, and it's the Department of Transportation that's doing it. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's use this as an opportunity to thank the panel with something. Would anybody else like to speak?
Sorry, can I do one?
Yes, you can.
Sorry.
But you have to come over here, out of the dark.
How are you? Jason DeVellis, Attleboro. So what I'd like to see with your recommendation is something that ties into the common person. Academics can know the value of saying certainty, so they refrain from saying this is going to happen. You can't be 100%, but we understand how valuable 100% is. But if you tied it to things like, if we rose 4 feet, this is what happens to your groundwater. You won't be able to drink. Your house will not be livable anymore. Because we know transportation infrastructure, we really need to get the public support though. But using things like that, also, maybe you could still live in your house, but all of a sudden you're in a flood zone with a storm, and you're going to have to pay FEMA insurance because the maps have changed, right? People like to think that once they get set into I bought my house, I'm all set for life. My parents did it, my grandparents lived in the house. We never had any problems. They have to understand that, 40 years from now, they might be facing a different world, and they shouldn't be surprised.
Sergeant, can I get an alibi?
An alibi? You can get a second time, but you can't get an alibi.
It's an alarming charge. The gentleman just brought up an important thing, FEMA. We have flood maps for real estate in our town. You legally cannot use flood map information to sell a home. Well, that's stupid. I needed to actually sneak around my neighborhood and make friends with my neighbors and ask them surreptitiously where the flood line was. And so I have a house that's not subject to flooding, but we need some legal relief here. We need the right for homeowners to know their property will be subject to flood insurance, which right now is rising uncontrollably. And that's simply the law. Change that
State
first.
law?
It may be federal. It's so stupid it sounds like it was congressional. But so I don't know what levers you need to pull, but we need to pull some levers here. Or
yeah. I mean, as each municipality develops the vulnerability assessment, that information will also become public. Whether or not it's going to be tied to insurance levels is a different question, but that's
no,
something that
it will be tied
municipalities
to
will
insurance
grapple
levels,
with.
but real estate agents right now are forbidden by law to tell you as a prospective buyer,
right,
this property is or is not in the floodplain.
Well, if you're smart enough to just learn. I shouldn't say if you're smart enough.
So I'm going to do one last call. And so this is the actual closing bell for. We've now had 5 listening sessions across the state. It's incredibly useful. We're moving from our a robust set of looking at facts and trends in our 5 different committees, developing potential plausible scenarios for the future. And commission members, we're going to be soon diving into what a set of recommendations will look like. And each one of these sessions has been incredibly helpful, and appreciate you all being here. Thanks very much.